This is the SCA harassment and bullying policy. The SCA prohibits harassment and bullying of all individuals and groups. Participants engaging in this behavior are subject to appropriate sanctions. If you are subjected to harassment, bullying, or retaliation, or if you become aware of anyone being harassed or bullied, contact a seneschal, president of the SCA, or your kingdom's board ombudsman. And with that, welcome to Introduction to ANS Documentation. I'm Mariette. I'm the East Kingdom Deputy Minister of Arts and Sciences for Education. We'll be going over the basics, the very first approach, things that we need to keep in mind when we are writing documentation for our ANS projects. And so at various points, I'll be asking you, have you done this before? Feel free to just nod your head. You can use the reaction buttons, give a thumbs up, whatever you like. But I will start by asking, how many of you have created ANS documentation before of any kind whatsoever? We've got one person shaking their head no. I know Amalia definitely has. Siobhan, you have for
just for paneling, which is not the same as ANS.
That's fine. But you have some underpinning of, this is what we need to show to demonstrate what we have done on this topic, which is great. Amalia in chat, yes, you have. I know you have, because you're one of our Kingdom ANS champions. Kind of a requirement. But if you've opened up the documents, one of the things that keeps people away from displaying their work or competing in various levels of ANS competition is fear over creating documentation. This class is designed to make it as easy as possible for you to create that first documentation. If you've already created documentation, it's also a really great reminder of the basics, even as we go deeper and deeper into our research, to not forget kind of the entry level things that we need to make sure we're talking about in our documentation. So I hope if you come away with nothing else from this conversation, that documentation does not need to be as scary as a lot of people can sometimes make it out to be. And whether that comes from anxiety that you experienced writing essays in high school, college, wherever, whether the idea of doing research is intimidating, I am here to tell you we all start somewhere. And that somewhere is always going to be, what is it that I have made, right? As medieval reenactors, as medieval creationists, we are creating things all the time. The first thing we need to make sure is in our documentation is, what is it that we have made? And we want that to be as specific as possible. What is the thing? Describe the thing that you made. Is that a scroll? Is that a garment? Is that, a composition of, whether it's poetry, music, whatever? What is the thing that you made? Be specific and talk about the challenges you faced, because that's one of the things when someone comes and asks you about your project, when a judge comes and asks you about what you have done, they want to know, have you challenged yourself? What task did you set before yourself? What were your goals in creating this item? Now, that is related to, what was this based on, right? So there's the thing we make, and there's the thing that we were trying to recreate. And in an ideal world, we make those things as similar as possible. But we live in the 21st century, not the 10th century, not the 14th century. We live in a modern world. And so sometimes the things that we have access to, sometimes the things that we use are not the same. But here's the thing I made. Here's the thing I wanted to make from whatever period it is that you're recreating. When showing what it was based on, we want to know as much about that. Not just, hey, here's this thing. What culture does it come from? That can be defined in terms of what country, what specific time period, what, specific subregion. You want to give as much information there as humanly possible. and I'm going to use Italy as an example here. Italy in the medieval period was not Italy. There was no unified one thing that was really Italy. Italy was a number of different city-states, right? The way things were done in Sicily would be very different from the way they are done in, Florence, would be done in Rome. So things are not just, medieval Italian. They are a very specific place in Italy. Likewise, things shift, and if we're talking about fashion, they can shift by decade. They can shift by, 20 or 30 or 50 years. So don't just say the 14th century. If you happen to know it was specific to the the 1380s, be that specific. Be as specific as you possibly can. If you have extant images, you want to show those as well. You want to, say, here's what I made. Here's this image of this very specific thing that it's based on. So we get a sense of time, of place, of culture. We get a precision in what we are recreating. In addition to those kind of, who, what, when, where ideas, there is also the role that that item played in the culture. So sometimes it can be as simple as this was a tool that was used, it's an object of utility. But we may also have objects that are ostentatious displays of wealth. Here's this thing that exists because we definitely, because we want to show off how much money we have, right? Whatever role that object played in the society, you want to discuss that. It's not just a thing that existed, it's a thing that somehow survived so that we know enough about it. Let's hear how they would have used it. So think about current, if you ever did current events in school as a kid, who, what, when, where, why? Why does this item exist? What was the utility of this item? That gives us a good background before leading into your actual process, right? So what did you create? What is it based on? As much information as we know about the thing it was based on. But then we get into how you actually created it, right? And so this is frequently called the materials section. We want to know very specifically, what did you use to create your item? This can be presented as a list of materials. You can write paragraphs about this. This can be presented in a variety of ways. You can bring sample pieces of those materials and display it if you're doing an in-person display. But you want to show all the things that, were consumed in the process. If we're talking about garb, that could be fabric, that could be thread. If we're talking about scribal arts, this is, your paints, your papers, your gilding materials. If we're talking about metalwork, we can have a sample of the physical, metal, the type of metal that you used. Again, being as specific as possible. And I see a hand raised. Siobhan, do you have a question?
Yeah, when you're talking about your materials, for instance, if you're making, we'll just go with garb. I don't do garb, but just that's a good example to use. That's supposed to be made out of linen and you're going to make it out of linen. Do you also have to go into the discussion of how linen is different today than it was then?
That is absolutely something that documentation can discuss, because there's a very real question of, so here's, silk that we have access to. And I feel like silk is one of those things, because of its expense and because of how different silks can be from period to now. So yes, this is silk, but is this the right weave of silk that would have been used?
Because
right?
This could very easily turn into a book. I mean,
Yes.
like a big book. And I don't know where to draw that line.
So I would say the guidelines for what you're using this documentation for are always a good place to start, right? I'm going to use East Kingdom A&S Champs as an example. There's a page limit on your documentation. like we cut you off, and I think it's at 6 pages, maybe it's 8, I don't know, but we cut you off at a certain point. So you want to give as much detail as you possibly can, given the limits. And I'm going to talk at the end of class about the difference between full documentation and what I call kind of like the one-page overview for the person that's just kind of like doing a drive-by of your presentation, because those
Thank you.
two are very different things as well.
Thank you.
But to that point, when you talk about your materials, you do want to explain, okay, they would have used linen and period. If you have the information about, how tight a weave that linen would have been, that's something that shows your knowledge of the subject. Include that in your documentation. You, again, just like with you describing the object you're recreating, you want to be as specific in your material description as humanly possible. Don't just say, I used linen. Talk about, the weave per inch, the density. If you're using thread and you know about the spin, talk about that. And we definitely have had people display who, have done so much research into the thread that would have been used that they can tell you about the direction of the twist in the yarn. Again, that's not my area of expertise, but it is something that there is information out there to, know more about. Whatever it is, the type of paper, don't just say paper. What type of paper did you use? If you're substituting one thing for another, it's very important to talk about the reasons behind the decisions that you've made. But at the very least, make sure you say, hey, here's what I used. Here's what they would have used. Here's, why I made the decisions that I made. And Amalia has a great point. Start somewhere. If you don't know about the twist of yarn, if you don't know about the tightness of the weave, but you do know that it was made of linen, tell us that, right? Tell us what you know. And that's why the subtitle of this class I refer to as Show What You Know. Show us what you know about this topic. So with material, go ahead.
How do you do a complete brain dump in 6 pages?
Well, so we don't want a brain dump, right? We want to create a little bit of organization. So that's why we start with the what, here's what I made. And then we have the materials, what I made it with, right? So it's always good to think about sections. So what are the essential elements of your object? What are they constructed from? How do they differ from what was used in period? So again, even if you are making decisions where you're altering what you're using from what would have been used in period, if it's too expensive, say so. I mean, absolutely say so. On my first A&S documentation, I acknowledged the fact that, using the proper silk for my hanging scroll would have been prohibitively expensive. There is no way I'm going to spend like hundreds of dollars for a yard of fabric just to get the exact right thing. That's okay. It's okay to make substitutions. Just show us that you understand that they are substitutions and what they're being substituted for. Materials leads us into methods. Materials are the things that we consume when we make our objects. Methods are the how. So think of this again as another section, right? So did you hand sew it versus machine sew it? Obviously in period, we would have hand sewn everything, right? We didn't have sewing machines then. It's okay to acknowledge that you used a sewing machine. If you did use a sewing machine, you should say so. This also includes tools. Understanding what tools would have been available to a craftsman at that moment in time is something that you would want to share. And then if you're using different tools to create your object, acknowledge that. Again, it is fine to use different tools, but if you know what they would have used, showing that you know that is part of what we'd expect to see in the methods section. Other things that you can discuss, the steps in the process. If you have a particularly involved process, breaking it down into first I did this, then I did this, then I did that. you can absolutely set it up that way. If you created any of your tools, that would be something you absolutely want to include. Again, creating your own tools is not a requirement to show your work, but if you have done that, please, you'd want to make sure that people know that. If you've done any experimental archaeology in the process of creating your object, please, that is something where you're putting in a level of work that we should know about. And I'll use the example of glue, which seems like a strange thing, but it's a thing. We know that they had to have used glue to secure one surface to another and so one of the things I do is Japanese hanging scrolls. There is very, very little information from period texts about what glue they would have used. But we know what they would have had access to. We know what's used in modern scroll work. And so we can play with, okay, how does this work? I'm going to test it on this surface. I'm going to test it on that surface. And you can show your work, right? I use this glue on this example and here's how it worked. I use this glue on this example and here's how it worked. Show your work, right? Discuss why you chose to use what you chose in the end. That shows a process of experimentation. That shows a process of investigating what they could have possibly done. So if you don't have the benefit of, hey, here's this period manual on how to do this art, we can still recreate that idea of I'm exploring in the same way that they would have explored as artisans in that period with the things that they had access to. So show us how you did what you did. Make sure you highlight differences. What do we know? What do we not know about how they would have done in period? What questions do we still have about it? What do we not know? And what are future avenues for research in that area? Because that is something we can explore as well. So we have what we created. We had the materials we created it with. We had the method we used to create it. Then we get to sources. And this is sometimes where people get really, really, really nervous because maybe at school at some point you were told you have to use MLA format, you have to use APA format, you have to use Chicago style citations, whatever it was. And if you feel comfortable with any of those things, by all means, use it. I'm a college English teacher. I talk about MLA and APA all day long. I feel comfortable using those things. So I do that when I create my documentation. Please, please, please know that none of those are required for you to use when you're creating your documentation. You should have sources, and we want to see evidence of those sources, but that can be done in any of a variety of ways. If that's in-text citations and a bibliography because that's what you're comfortable with it, great. You can just, make notes in the sections where you're quoting sources. You can have a list of sources that you've used. Some people will bring their sources physically with them to a display table. So where they've had, things highlighted in their physical books or in articles that they've printed out to show to whoever is coming around to look at their work. Any of those is perfectly acceptable. The more important thing is the quality of your sources. So while we are really, really okay with a wide range of how you show them to us, we'd like to see primary source of some kind, and certainly respectable secondary sources. So what does that mean? Primary sources are things that are, existing from period. So this can be the object itself. On this, we want to go to respected sites. So this may be going to a museum or, images from an archaeological dig, making sure that the images of the extant object are reputable. They're not just something that someone put up on Pinterest and who knows where they came from. We want to make sure that there is some actual, verification that this is in fact an object from period that we're recreating. Sometimes that is going to be textual evidence. So if we're thinking about cooking, for example, you can't all of a sudden pull out, a meal from a medieval feast, right? We're going on, reports of people who, created that menu, reports of people who ate at that feast, references to those meals. So primary sources that tell us about the things that existed also work here. Having secondary sources that are also reputable is important. So many people have studied the primary things that exist in museums, that exist in archaeological digs. Having those people who are respected scholars in their fields and reading the articles that they publish in journals through various organizations is also a really, really great tool to pull into your documentation. We want to avoid things that are, so Pinterest in images is a great example. Pinterest is not generally a super reliable way to get information about, hey, let's, recreate this. Sometimes museums do have accounts where they're sharing images. And if you can trace back that Pinterest image, great. But starting at the museum sites itself, starting at historical organizations, that tends to give you a better baseline of an image to recreate. We want to avoid people's blogs in general. So some people have fantastically academic blogs where they show their sources and they, are giving us real academic information. But there's no one editing someone's blog as a general rule. So blogs, really you need to take with a grain of salt. Just because someone writes something on the internet does not necessarily mean that it is worthy of citing in your documentation. If you have access to an academic database, that's wonderful. Again, not required. You can use tools like Google Scholar and find reputable sources that way as well. There are a number of search engines that you can tailor down to, I don't want to see this particular type of thing. If you do, and that's a great tip, Amalia, if you do find an image that isn't coming from a respected source, you can try a reverse image search. So if it's something that you really, really would like to recreate, make the internet work for you. See if you can use that to find what that, the original source of that image. But ultimately, we want to see sources, we want to see images that are verifiably based in period, that are scholarly in their nature, primary sources, scholarly secondary sources. That's the gold standard. So, anyone have any question about sources? Because I feel like sources and, citations are a big, big question. We good? Okay. So, those are the big sections. What did I make? What materials did I use to make it? How did I make it? What sources did I use to, demonstrate that information? So, and question in chat, would using a blog as a starting point and checking sources be an okay thing? Yes, you just need to be able to run back that information. At this point, the SDA has been around for many, many years, and we have many, many people who have done amazing research and share that research on their personal web pages. That's a wonderful thing and can be a great starting point. But you want to go back to their sources when you are choosing to add sources to your own documentation. You probably should not be citing that person's blog. Go to where they got that information and look at that documentation. And in terms of SDA publications, so I would say the Complete Anachronist might be an exception to that rule. The Complete Anachronist has an extraordinary standard for what they publish. And those complete anachronist editions themselves have extensive citations. So you probably could get away with a complete anachronist, but I would still suggest looking at the sources that they are citing as opposed to just using someone else's documentation as a source for your documentation. And so again, a good source will also point you in a lot of other directions to find new sources. And here's where I will do a Wikipedia sidebar. Wikipedia is really, really accessible, is really, really easy to read. Problematic because anyone can edit it, but if it's a good Wikipedia page, it will have all those source links and you can go and find that information elsewhere. A good website, a good journal article, a good source will send you into a lot of resources where you can deepen your own research. Follow the rabbit hole down all those different avenues that, you know, whoever you're looking at, whatever they have done, see what else that article is citing. See what else they have looked at, because sometimes it can lead you to truly, truly fantastic sources. Okay, so another idea, as long as we're on the topic of writing. So you've got your sources, great. They can be in whatever format you want. They can be, you know, just a list of sources at the end. Another thing that people get really, really concerned about is that they're going to be judged on their writing. And I say this again as a college English teacher. We are not grading you on grammar, spelling, punctuation, any of that. Yes, you need to write clearly enough so that we understand what you said, but please do not let the reason why you don't show your work, why you don't compete, because you are worried that you used too many run-ons. We are not there to judge how well you write in the English language. We are there to see how you've explored this item that you've created, how you've explored the research on this topic. So definitely, you know, to dispel that big myth. Another note, if you are creating documentation specifically for a competition, whatever the competition is, a lot of the rubrics are very, very similar that competitions will use. But if you're in a competition, you definitely will, you know, wind up being judged by a rubric. Make sure you look at that rubric before finalizing your documentation. While a lot of documentation will be similar from competition to competition, there may be a specific focus of a competition so where you have to address something beyond the basics. But in general, all documentation, all rubrics want to know what you've created, how you've created it. But also, do not let a rubric be the reason why you do not create documentation. A rubric is not a checklist of I must do all these things. A rubric just provides judges a level playing field for, you know, creating something that they can score people on. They also, if used well, can be a fantastic tool for you to develop your project further. It is not a black or white thing, it's a scale. For each of these different criteria, you're graded from, you know, a 1 to a 5, 1 to a 6, depending on what rubric you're looking at. So please do not feel like the fact that a rubric is going to be used and you need to be, you know, checking off on the highest category before you submit. Don't let that be the thing that stops you from sharing your work with the artistic community. It is about trying to assess fairly wildly different projects, and it's nothing more than that. So, trying to read the questions in chat. And so while I'm reading chat, does anyone have any other questions? And Anna, I'm actually going to ask you to if you can clarify the question that you put in chat. So can you explain what you mean by point out the what is it?
Sure. The project I'm looking at working on is pretty big and does not have an extant example, which means I'm working backwards from 19th and 18th century sources and also using 10th century sources, meeting in the middle.
Okay.
I'd be working on little pieces of it over a very long period of time. So if I want to show something, I'd have to choose a piece.
Okay. So I think it might help to, yes, in that initial section, discuss the fact that this is part of a larger project that you are working on. It shows, hey, here's this specific task I'm completing in the hope to develop this final project along the way, and explain, exactly what you just said. Like, so we have this from the 10th century, we have this from the 19th century. So we know that something happened in between there. Like, acknowledge that, absolutely acknowledge that. And I think we see that in dance too, right? Like, we know people danced and we know we have manuals from this point. Like, so we have to figure out what happened in between those two things, right? I think that happens with food a lot. So again, acknowledging the scope of the project, acknowledging that this is one piece of that larger thing in that introduction would be, I think, a smart way to go about it. Great question. Other questions, other thoughts? The big idea. It does not have to be an intimidating research paper. At its most basic, you are showing what you've done. That does not need to be 6 pages, cited, annotated. It can be. And certainly, once you get deep enough into your research, I know that for the times I've competed in King and Queen's Arts and Sciences Championships, I had to really kind of edit myself down to get into that page limit. And if that's something that you need help with, that's one of the things that I'm more than happy to do, in my role as the education deputy. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about, editing their writing down. But please, please, please show us what you know. Show us what you've done. Talk about the challenges that you faced along the way. Acknowledge what you did well and what you struggled with and what you're going to do next. And that shows us that you're engaging in the process of learning more about your art or science, learning more about your craft, and going on to the next level and figuring out where do I go from here. And that's how we grow arts and sciences in all of our different sub genres that we have here. I will say there are many, many more resources about documentation on the East Kingdom website. There is the ANS rubric on the East Kingdom website. All those resources are available to you. The links are on the bottom of the handout, so you can go right to those places. But other than that, unless there are other questions, I will say thank you all for coming. I can't wait to see what you know and for you to show it to us, whether that's at a display, whether that's at competition, or whether it's just in consultation when you want to work with someone from the ANS office to kind of keep fine-tuning what you're working on.
You are so amazing. This was the best ever.
I should probably stop recording now. Seriously, anyone have any questions at all?
Thank you for clearly explaining things. I'm new, so this would be, I'm contemplating submitting something to demo for the first time. So
do it. So that's the biggest thing I can say is do it. The first time, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid. And
Sorry.
it is hard. I'm not gonna lie. It took me many, many years before I actually shared my work in competition.
Yes,
So-
that's true.
shush. But we really do want people from all levels to share their work, just so that we can continue to talk to people about what they're working on and continue to develop them and put you in connection with other people who can help you, whether it's finding new sources, finding someone else to, bounce ideas off of. Show us what you're doing.
Yeah, I kind of got into SCA because people kept telling me you need to go into ANS and compete. So
I will also say this. So I'm an ANS person. I love ANS. I want everyone to show what they're doing. Please do not feel like you need to compete if you don't want to compete. If you just want to show what you're doing without the stress of having someone judge you, you can absolutely display. Even at big events where we are doing the Kingdom ANS Championship, you can just display at that if competition is something you want to ease your way into. But you could be like me and just jump into the deep end of the pool and have your first ANS competition be King Queen ANS. So
yeah,
And you did
probably
great.
doing demo.
do the demo and share with us how you do. And Amalia, I'm going to read what Amalia just said in chat. Don't be afraid if you don't know all the things about your topic. Everyone starts somewhere. Absolutely true. And, again, we can have those conversations with you, and we want to have those conversations with you. We want to help you find more things to, more rabbit holes to crawl down if that's what you want to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are blatantly wrong things in the first documentation that I ever wrote. It's fine. We all do it. Just start somewhere.
That is so true. And I will say, if I look back at the first thing that I documented compared to the second, I'm just all the things I would have done differently, all the things. But that's okay. It's a learning process. All right, I'm going to stop recording, and then we'll chat more. But again, thank you all. Again, all the resources are available on the EK Ministry of Arts and Sciences website. My name is Mariette. Please contact me if you have any questions at all about documentation, about teaching, about education stuff within the ANS world of the SCA. All right. And